This is John Manley from Much Ado About Corona.ca with my son Jonah Aaron Manley.
Yes, and Jordan Henderson, painter, artist, COVID-19 restriction opposer, Jordan Henderson.
Who's in Washington State?
That's right, with our own dictator.
Your dictator, is it a woman?
No, that's Oregon, actually. Our dictator
Oregon,
is
yeah.
Inslee.
Yeah, sorry, okay, well that's nice. Now we're going to be looking at Jordan's new painting, which is, I'm going to mess up the order of the animals and the shepherds if I say the title, so I'm going to let you say
I
it.
can do it for you. Sheep,
Please.
shepherds, and goat.
All right. Now my son is blind, so we thought he'd be the best person to critique your artwork. No,
Dad is a real comedian, everybody, so yes.
I've also found too that describing things to people who can't see actually makes me see them better, so that is another possibility. You might see something you never saw before.
But also, Dad started to piece together that the space station might be fake, just by describing it to me. He started to notice things.
Now you just alienated all the listeners who believe in the space station. Maybe let's start with where you came up with the idea for this painting.
Yeah, sure. So the idea first came to me in that I wanted to use some pretty common analogies here in let's say the Western world, if you will, which is using sheep and goats and shepherds and, like a black sheep as an odd one out as a method of describing humans, basically, right? By giving them these animal attributes.
I used to think it was a bad analogy because I used to say, well, the humans that are being enslaved do a lot more to help the people enslaving them than the sheep do to their with their shepherds. The shepherds have to herd them around, protect them, provide for them.
It's true, though shepherds they take care of a flock, right? So that ultimately they can take something from that flock, right? Such as wool or milk, or ultimately, eat some of the sheep. That shepherds aren't exactly selfless in their care for their flock. So that's kind of where the analogy first began, is I wanted to build something on this analogy. And the first issue I ran into is I wanted to, of course, have the sheep wearing face masks, right? But a face mask doesn't really look great on anyone, but it looks especially silly on a sheep because they don't have a face, they've got a muzzle. So that's where I decided I would use the traditional imagery of fauns or satyrs from Greek mythology, especially, where it combines a human and an animal form, such as a goat. So I figured that way they're basically humans, but they still represent the animals within that analogy, right? So that's where the foreground basically came from, where you have this goat here, right, that's trying to call the sheep away, who are on a path leading to a rather unpleasant place, right, kind of a hellish place. And, we see a factory in the background. If we zoom in here, we see these signs, right, such as, the Carnage Cafe, Fauci's Feast, Fear-Fed Mutton since 1984, since Fauci was put in his current position back in 1984.
Fauci's
Feast. Lamb Steakhouse, things like that, right? So the implication being that the sheep are definitely being used by the shepherds for a purpose they probably don't want to be. So the idea being that, the sheep aren't willing to see what's going on, but for any other observer, you can see that quite clearly the sheep are going to be used for someone else's purpose. And right here, once we get into the sheep, that's where a second layer of the analogy begins, and that's that they're all exactly the same. The goat here that's telling them to leave, and all the sheep that are in a line ready to head into what is effectively a slaughterhouse, are physiologically identical. There's no difference between them. The sheep have followed the instructions on this sign by the door telling them to, for everyone's safety, remove their horns, to muzzle up, to trim nails and hooves, no sharp items, and a reminder that they are all in this together. That idea was to kind of throw it into an airport type feeling, which everything's starting to feel like an airport now, right, as far as all checks at different places. So the sheep have done that. They've obeyed that. So their horns they've removed, and they are wearing masks. But all of them actually have goat horns. So let me show an image or two here. Oh, trimming nails, just the implication that the shepherds want everything removed which they could possibly use to fight back with. So if you look at a goat, right, goats almost always have these strongly vertical horns, such as this image here. You can pick just about any image of a goat you want, and the horns begin at quite a strong vertical angle, whereas if we go over to a sheep, you can see that there, right? The horns start out more horizontal.
Oh.
So even though in the image they've chopped their horns off, you can see there's enough of the horns that you can see all of them have goat horns. None of them actually have sheep horns. Even the sheep, they have goat horns. And then all of them have this kind of fuzzy, white, soft beard and hair, which is reminiscent of sheep. So they're really actually all a combination of goat and sheep. And the reason I did that is I wanted to focus the viewer's attention on their actions, that the only thing that's differentiating this goat from all the sheep is his actions, that he's not going along with the crowd. But physiologically, they're all identical. There's no difference. The transformation center is a euphemism, right? That they're going to be turned into, if we look in the background, such as, let's say, shepherd's pies with fresh mutton. And that's what we see a lot now, is a lot of euphemisms, right? So something like social isolation, which is exactly what it is. They call it social distancing. They won't just identify it for what it truly is. Same thing with surveillance. They'll call it something like contact tracing, right? So I wanted to bring in some of that usage of euphemisms rather than calling things what they are. So that's why it's called the Transformation Center. Like right now, the idea being that everything that happens is somehow for our own good. Never mind if people are starving to death. Ultimately, it's for our own good.
Oh yeah, right. But they don't even see the past that door through the factory. There's other clone sheep humans being hung up on that line and then be on that streets with the restaurants and stuff on them.
That's true, and I wanted to make that really obvious, right? Like, it's really consternating. Why don't the sheep see what's going on? Because it is quite clear, and I think that's the same thing we have going on right now, that it really doesn't take a whole lot of analysis for it to become pretty clear that this is not for people's good, right? That masks and lockdowns and social distancing are not improving people's well-being. But people don't seem to see it anyways. It doesn't seem to matter how obvious it is. People will just, continue going along with it. And that's something else I wanted to bring in, was kind of the anger of all these sheep in the foreground, that they're really very displeased at this one goat that's walking away. And we kind of see that now, right? That wearing masks, everyone's going along, and they really get irritated with just one or two people not going along with everyone else.
My neighbor sent me a surprisingly profane email to that regard after leaving a flyer at his door about the harms of masking.
As far as he was angry at you for having
left that type of propaganda garbage at his front door.
Propaganda garbage.
They only had 24 scientific citations, so I guess,
How did you bring that up?
But I think that's why I thought your painting might be very helpful, because in some ways I feel like we're, us on the writing side and the journalistic side, trying to prove to people that social distancing, masking, and locking everybody in their homes is unhealthy. It's like, I feel like sometimes I'm overanalyzing the situation, trying to prove it to them when it's just blatantly obvious that it's not helpful. And I mean, in your painting, it's blatantly obvious that going to this transformation center is not in their best interest.
Yeah. So I hope to capture some of that frustration of how people can't see something that obvious. Another layer here is with the goat itself, right? Because goats traditionally are thought of as more independent than sheep. So, that's obviously why it's being called a goat. A second layer is the traditional use of a scapegoat, right? Of pinning sins on a goat and sending it out into the desert, blaming the goat for all one's problems. So the independent thinker represents that too, right? So, if we continue getting more cases, even though all the cases are basically happening from people wearing masks, because people who don't wear masks don't get tests and therefore don't get it. But the blame for it is those couple people without masks, right? Even though 95% of people are wearing masks, it's the couple out there not wearing them. That's why we have this issue. So that's another layer to a goat, the usage of a goat, right? It's traditional usage as a scapegoat, put all the blame on a goat. And then a third layer here, which is kind of an interesting layer, which I was playing with, is that goats are, especially goat-human combinations, are used in satanic imagery, right? And what we could say is that goats basically have been demonized. And there's nothing demonic about goats. I mean, you've been around goats, right? They're just animals. There's nothing particularly good or bad about them in comparison to other animals.
They just don't like being milked and exploited and stuff like that.
Yeah, they can be fairly independent-minded, but really they're just an animal. They're not bad. And right now we see independent thinkers, of course, constantly being demonized, as if they're really evil, they really hate other people, they want to see grandma die. So the idea of goats unjustifiably being demonized and treated as something kind of satanic when they're not, I felt like also played into the analogy, as far as independent thinkers are just, viewed as really horrible people just for thinking independently and are demonized. So even though that's kind of a bit odd, it seems like that would go against the role I wanted for this goat. I felt like it actually played into it as far as goats being demonized, but it's unjust that they are. They're just goats.
Goats can be rather smelly, I found, though, but otherwise I agree with you.
That's true, but it doesn't make them evil, right?
No, it just makes them bad bathers.
It does. I believe we don't associate that with independent thinkers, but maybe because they're probably not washing their hands obsessively with dangerous hand sanitizers constantly before walking in and out of any building.
Yeah, well.
Some ways I feel that even the term independent thinkers is inappropriate, because a lot of times it's just perceivers. It's like in this painting, I don't think it would require independent thought to realize that these people are going to their death. And that's how I kind of feel about other things, locking down people's businesses so they can't work. I don't think it requires much independent thought at all to realize. Actually, it requires more thoughts to believe that that's actually helpful.
Well,
that is true. It's just perceiving what's actually happening. That's a very good point.
Well, I think what's really the big issue isn't so much that they're not seeing through that. It's that they think that that this is such a big emergency that they need to do all this crazy stuff. What they really need to see that'll wake them up is that it's not a big emergency, which shouldn't be that hard to see. And then they'll say, oh, well then we shouldn't be doing all this harmful stuff if it's not a big emergency. We shouldn't be locking ourselves down.
Well, and that is interesting that it really seems to have more of a religious quality to it than almost anything else. Not even really a religion that any of us would be familiar with, as far as like in the past century, let's say, in most countries, most religions are fairly tolerant. Like they just have to deal with other religions. They don't have much choice about it. But now we're seeing something that I feel like would be more of what people may have seen, say, in the Middle Ages or other eras of greater religious intolerance, that you can't have anyone going outside the flock. You can't have anyone not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it really is kind of like a blind faith and worship almost of the authorities.
That's very interesting. Because that's how it was in the Middle Ages. You weren't Catholic, and if you lived in Spain or France or England, you got burned at a stake.
Yeah, for having wrong doctrine, that could happen to you.
And I think what Jonah just said there too is people think there's a horrible pandemic, and that's the key word there, isn't it? Is that they think there is. They don't see one.
That's true. They don't.
And that's maybe why your painting is a better, well, it's maybe not a better medium than the written word, but it's certainly a helpful one, because it's about seeing instead of thinking. Because words are just a lot of thoughts put on paper, or voices on a video or TV screen.
Yeah, it is a different way of communicating, and I hope that I can kind of hit upon some things that are hard to convey otherwise. A couple other points here. The road that they're on is paved with flags, right? And if I zoom in,
I was wondering what those were.
So the red flags with the stars are, of course, the flag of China, and then the other flags with the green, white, and red stripe are the flags of Italy. So the road in the painting is physically paved with the flags of China and Italy, because figuratively, the way to lockdowns was paved by China and Italy as the first countries to really heavily implement lockdowns and put their entire population on house arrest. I wanted to make sure to get both China and Italy in there because right now everyone's being polarized. They're trying to divide people into camps. Like you're either right wing or left wing, or you're against, let's say, the Western countries and in favor of, say, Russia and China, or vice versa. So I wanted to place the criticism both on the East and the West. So the East with China and the West with Italy, just to make sure I'm not taking a partisan stance there. That both sides deserve a lot of criticism for that. Another point that's kind of a bipartisan criticism is on the wall here of the euphemistically named Transformation Center. There's a symbol that more or less represents the presidential seal. Here, let me go ahead and pull up a presidential seal, actually.
What's a presidential seal?
Yeah, we're Canadians.
Oh, okay. Well, the presidential seal is used as a seal, the official seal of the President of the United States. When they're speaking at, let's say, a podium, they'll have this seal on the podium. Traditionally, I suppose they might have actually used the seal to stamp documents. Here you can see the seal, right, with an eagle in the center of it, holding an olive branch to represent peace, a clutch of arrows to represent war. A lot of interesting symbolism around there. So a seal we tend to think of as a stamp of approval in its traditional usage, right? Even though nobody really uses seals anymore, but that's what it is. So I wanted the seal on here to represent that this has the president's stamp of approval, right? Like the president's approve of this. It wouldn't happen if they really strongly opposed it. And up above the seal to either side, I placed a clock. So on the left wing of the bird's left wing, the clock's hands point to the 4, and then right between the 6 and the 7, more or less, to represent Biden moving into Kamala Harris, however that works out. And then on the right wing of the bird, I had the clock hands point to the 4 and the 5, representing Trump, right? So the right wing and the left wing. The bird in both hands, or both talons, feet, is holding vaccine syringes instead of the olive branch and the clutch of arrows, representing how Trump moved tons of money into the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm sure Biden will do the same thing. He certainly seems to be eager to do that. So I kind of wanted to imply that both wings of the bird are basically the same. Whichever wing you look at, it's the same policy there.
Okay, but how does these time stamps that the clocks point at represent the Biden and Kamala Harris on the left and Trump on the right?
It's just numbers. It's just that Trump being the 45th president, right? So the hands just point to the 4 and the 5. And then Biden's the 46th, but depending on how long he lives, Kamala could quite easily be the 47th. So that's why the hands point to the 4 and then between the 6 and the 7. And the amount of fraud going on, as we were just talking about, is really obvious, right? Like, how do you not see it, right? So usually, here in the U.S. anyways, people like to think that politicians are stupid, right? Usually whatever politician you don't like, you consider to be dumb. But I really don't think they are. I think they're fairly smart. So someone like Trump, I think, okay, if he's pouring money into the vaccine industry, right, and into pharmaceuticals, this is what he wants to happen, in my view. Initially, this entire seal was just going to be a criticism of Trump because I didn't think Biden would make it. I felt like the Democrats were kind of throwing the election. I don't know how you felt about this, John, but I felt like they were setting themselves up to lose by choosing Biden in a way. So initially that's what this was, but I wanted to criticize both wings basically for the role they play in this. And that's where the bird really comes in. And the main clue I gave to what the bird is the clocks on either side, which are cuckoo clocks, right? So the bird is the cuckoo bird. Yeah, so what cuckoo birds do, what common cuckoos do, is the female goes to lay an egg in another bird's nest, right? So in that case, it was a reed warbler. So the female cuckoo will go lay an egg in a reed warbler's nest. Then she'll take one of the reed warbler's eggs, and she'll throw it out of the nest. And her egg will hatch out first. And then it will push all of its quote-unquote siblings out of the nest, right? So it shoves all the others out. And then it gets all the food and attention from the parents who don't realize that it's not actually their chick.
Wow.
And it grows huge. It eventually dwarfs the parents. Then it flies off, and it does that to another nest. So cuckoo birds, one of the things that's interesting about them is they look like imposters, right? They actually are. They sort of look like a hawk. That's why they have this barring on their feathers. It makes them look more hawk-like so they can scare another bird away from their nest and then go in and lay one of their own eggs. So I felt that was a good representative of presidents in general, that they usually look like something they're not, kind of like a friend of the people, but they're not. These are cuckoo eggs up here instead of the stars that are usually on the flag. I mean what do you call it? The clouds that are usually on the flag. I put cuckoo eggs there instead. It's just another reference. But why I wanted to use a cuckoo bird instead of an eagle is I feel like people waste a ton of energy on our presidents here in the U.S., right? Like, it's so partisan. There's tons of news. People put out signs. Like, a lot of common people's energy goes into the presidential elections. But the presidents aren't really their friend, kind of like that cuckoo egg, that the parents think that cuckoo is their egg and they put all this time and energy into it. But ultimately, they're actually just feeding their enemy because they've mistaken their enemy as being their friend. But I felt like that was a pretty good analogy for presidents, as far as they always pose as people's friends, but really they aren't. You know, they'll do whatever their donors want them to do. So I felt like a cuckoo bird just kind of encapsulated more or less my view of what the president, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, usually is.
Would you say that's the case with all the American presidents, or just of late?
I feel like that's the case with most American presidents. There aren't many that I personally care for. Really not many at all. And I don't think you could really end up with a president that's really going to care about the people, because who's his billionaire backer going to be, right? You know, who's going to be providing all the money for him? And I feel like the old adage that he who pays the piper calls the tune really applies when it comes to U.S. presidents.
You have a painting or a charcoal sketch of Abraham Lincoln. Is he on your exception list?
Well, so a lot of the paintings I've done of historical people have been more just kind of as a study of their face. I don't necessarily like them if I paint them. I'm just intrigued by them.
No.
And Abraham Lincoln's a figure that I feel is kind of like an anti-hero, right? Like, I like some of the things he did, and other things he seems to have kind of done for the wrong reason. Like, it's great that he went against slavery, but reading some of his speeches, it sounds like he did it more almost just to win the war rather than it actually being the focus of the war. On the top of the Transformation Center is a symbol which is called a caduceus, right? So it's just a winged rod with two snakes twined around it. And here in the U.S., it's one of the primary symbols of medicine. Traditionally, it's not. The caduceus is actually a symbol of commerce. Around the turn of the last century, around the 19th into the 20th century, it started being used by the U.S. military for medicine, and now it's the dominant medical symbol. So I placed it on the Transformation Center to represent, as far as once you're going into here, right, this is a horrible place, and the gateway is medicine. That's the excuse, right, is people's well-being, supposedly, as far as the lockdowns and everything. Really, it's all medical-based, or that's the excuse for it, right? Here in the background, positioned right over Faci's feast, is a symbol that's called, I think, the bowl of Hygeia, I think is how it's pronounced, and it's the traditional symbol of pharmacy. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies have this symbol, and it's a snake wrapped around a bowl. There's also one of the restaurants is All You Can Eat Melinda's Mutton Massacre, which is, of course, is kind of a reference to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And above it, I positioned a symbol of the World Health Organization. I'll go ahead and pull that up. So this is their symbol, right? I believe they're actually just using the UN symbol, and then they put this rod of Asclepius, I think is how it's pronounced, with the snake twining around it. So I used the same symbol, but I took the snake and I flipped it around and turned it into an S, so it's basically a dollar symbol, which I felt like was a more appropriate symbol for the World Health Organization. Another point here, by the way, on the seal, which is just kind of a small point, but on the actual seal, the eagle's head is turned towards what would be the eagle's right, where it's holding the olive branch. And this happened under the Truman presidency. It traditionally was actually faced towards the arrows of war. So they switched it to the olive branch, as implying that the U.S. was focused on peace, right? Kind of like calling the War Department the Defense Department, even though it's definitely the War Department. So
Yeah.
we had to switch the head back the other direction towards where it would traditionally be holding the arrows.
As an artist, were you intimidated or reluctant about putting so much verbiage in a painting?
Not particularly. It was kind of actually fun. It was a bit different to bring in so much lettering into a painting. The only real difficulty, of course, is that from a distance, if you have this too small, a lot of it becomes unreadable.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does demand being placed at a fairly large size, even though really this is the main point, right? The foreground of the goat trying to lead the sheep away. That's the main painting, and all the rest is kind of a bonus. So in a way, if you can't see all that, that's okay. The shepherds here, which have the heads of wolves, right? You know, wolves as shepherds. And I feel really that in general is what shepherds are, because we use a shepherd as an analogy a lot, right? And a lot of people will get sensitive about this because it's especially used in the New Testament. Christ uses an analogy of God as a shepherd to people. But I think the problem is people take that analogy and then they apply it between people and people, right? So if you have a supreme all-good being as a shepherd, you know, that's one thing. But if you have another human being as a shepherd, I'd say that's not a very good situation. And even when human beings are shepherds of sheep, like we just discussed earlier, it's really so that they can use the sheep, right? They're going to shear the wool, they're going to milk the sheep, they're going to eat the sheep. The sheep are there for their own use. It's not for the benefit of the sheep. So in general, I don't think the idea of having a human being as your shepherd is a good idea. So the shepherds have wolf heads because I feel like that better represents them. Like if wolves were smarter, I think they would be shepherds. You know, instead of just eating sheep, they'd keep their own flock and then be a little more careful about how they shepherd that resource.
Yeah, but it's always, that's what I found so interesting with sheep, or rather not very good, was that the shepherds have to do all the fighting when the wolves attack. The sheep can't defend themselves. They need the shepherd to do that.
Yeah, that's true. They do, and that is where the analogy between shepherds as leaders for humans eventually breaks down, because really what we'd be talking about is sheep leading sheep, right? Since there is no equivalent to a shepherd to a human being. If a human being has another human being as their shepherd, that is like having another sheep as the shepherd of sheep.
I don't know if I agree with that, because that there's different types of psychological positions with humans. You have some people, well, a lot of people actually are like more like sheep, whilst others are more like shepherds. And 20% of the people are like shepherds and 80% are like sheep. Then you have the goats somewhere in there too.
That's very true. You do have those different personality types. And that was part of bringing in the physiological similarity between the goat and all the sheep, as having them all the same thing, that it's really just actions that differentiate them. So yeah, a lot of people do act more like sheep, and they do want to be led. They do want to have a shepherd. But ultimately, I don't think people really can be, in a way, right? Because they can make that choice. If you decide to have someone lead you, you're kind of responsible for that, right? Like you've made the choice that you're going to make them your leader, or ultimately you decided to do that, right? So I see what you're saying. I think that's true. There are definitely different types of people, but ultimately I don't think it's good for anyone to voluntarily be a sheep. Something I go back to a lot is human physical strength, right? At one place I worked, we would do a lot of racing, right? We'd all line up and would do like a 100-yard dash, and we were all kind of like, males in our 20s, right? And we'd all do that 100-yard dash, and some of us were faster than others, but we were all actually very close in our total speed. We'd all do 100 yards in probably like between 13 and 15 seconds. That's where we'd do 100 yards. And even professional athletes, like the best of the best, don't do it in much under 10 seconds. So even though there are definite different physical differences, it's not actually that great. It's, maybe a difference of somebody being twice as fast, but definitely not 3 times as fast if the other person is also in good shape and of a similar age and gender. So I think some people may be more gifted intellectually, but I don't think they could be that much further ahead of their fellow human beings, as long as that person is not, physically damaged or been poisoned or something. I don't think one could be way ahead of them in intellect.
To say that. But then why do we get people, like some humans, who are like smarter than everybody else?
Well, people definitely have different backgrounds and different experience. And if you've studied in something a lot, you will be a lot better. Just kind of like somebody who, let's say, never runs at all, isn't going to be able to run at all. But if they decided to run and start practicing, they'd be fairly fast.
It's actually interesting when your example was short distance running, but with long distance running, several kilometers, there's actually no difference in speed even between males and females, like in long marathons. There was one famous marathon where not only did a woman win the marathon, which they win just as often as men now, but she was also stopping frequently to breastfeed her newborn baby and still won the marathon.
That is crazy. That's
And that was the one of the foundations to Christopher McDougall's book, Born to Run, that males and females, there's actually no physiological advantage when it comes to long distance running.
Yeah. And then age isn't as much of a factor there either, is it? Right? I think some of the best like ultra marathon runners are in their 40s and 50s.
Yes. Yeah. But then any squirrel can beat us, but still, it's
That's true. Another thing I brought into the shepherds here is each of them's carrying a carrot along with the staff. So I'm not sure how clear this jumps out to people, but the idea was it's a carrot and a stick, right? So they're offering a reward as well as a punishment for compliance, and that's what we see a lot now, right? Like mask up to open up. So if you do what we tell you to do, we'll open up, which is the carrot, and if you don't, then we'll lock you back down, which is the stick. I initially thought of bringing in some symbolism to the gowns and the masks, and decided not to. I just wanted some chunks of color purely for artistic purposes, and I felt the composition was getting too busy to bring in any heavy symbolism onto the gowns themselves. So I kept them fairly basic.
Now these clones look suspiciously like Jordan Henderson with white hair, blonde hair.
They do. And I did use myself as the model for all of them. And the primary reason I did that is because
You're
I
on a
like
tight budget?
the simplest, cheapest, most convenient thing possible. And I am definitely the easiest person to have model. I use family quite a bit too, but I have to do a lot more guilt tripping to get them to model for me. So this simplified it, and it's also kind of funny because really it's an entire painting of myself yelling at myself for trying to lead myself away from what are also actually myself with a wolf head, which is kind of funny.
Oh, you're the wolves too, I guess that, yeah. Well, they all look the same build. They all go to the same gym, I guess.
And I also did that as well, just because to avoid confusion, right? Initially, I thought of using the black sheep metaphor, right? Because that's really popular here in the U.S. is to call yourself a black sheep if you're the odd one out. But right now, everything is racially really tense in the United States, right? And I was afraid that if I introduced different races, that people would somehow read race into the painting. And I really don't want that to be a part of the painting. I really want the painting focused on compliance or non-compliance with tyranny. So I just eliminated as many variables. There's no females. They're all the same age. They all look identical. Just to really focus the viewer's attention where I wanted the attention, which was on decisions. Yeah, it really just opens up tons of potential interpretations that I'd rather not deal with. So I tried to simplify that as much as possible. And again, it also does come down to logistics, that hiring models or even guilt-tripping family into modeling for you can become a lot of trouble to get that many people together. So a lot of artists historically have used themselves as a model where they can. Like Rembrandt, that's why he did so many self-portraits, right? He was always available for modeling. So that when I can, I do. It just simplifies things a lot. The sheep in the background heading into the slaughterhouse. If you look at pictures of slaughterhouses, usually this is how they'll string up cattle, right after they've slit the throats. They'll just put them on there and send them in. And it's kind of dreadful, which I was happy with because sometimes I'm kind of dreadful, but it's also fairly tame, right? There's no blood, there's no gore. It's fairly PG, but it gives I hope, a horrific feeling without getting into any gore or bloodshed.
I mean, in this it's a little interesting because you have them actually eating the sheep, whilst the situation right now with the COVID scandal, they're not actually eating the people. In some ways, it's almost like there's no real benefit to their destruction other than to get them out of the way, I'd assume.
Yeah, that could be the case, just to get people out of the way. And again, any analogy does start to break down at a one. Here, you could interpret it that way if you wanted. They might just be getting rid of some of the sheep, tossing them to the side. I do feel like they view, when people gain enough power, even like in a business, even some small businesses, they'll start to view their employees not really as people, but almost like cattle to be managed. Another aspect was the smokestacks in the back. Part of that was just to give kind of a hellish feeling and imply that it's a factory. But I also wanted to bring that in because all the initial, quote unquote outbreaks of COVID-19 were in the areas of the world with some of the worst air pollution, where they typically run tons of respiratory illnesses during that time of year. So I just wanted to just fill the air with tons of junk, as far as just a little bit of a reference to the beginning of all this. It could be just generating energy for running the whole place, or perhaps they're cooking them. I'm not sure. I thought of it kind of like a resort for the wolves to go and eat things and hang out. So, the Den Inn and Suite, same thing, just playing into the whole wolf idea. The same thing with live howling at the Carnage Cafe, playing into wolves. The clock up here, I placed the clock in there anyways just because it looked good, but I didn't want to waste the opportunity for a reference, right? I mean, why do that, right? So I placed the hand to the 9 and 11 just as a 9/11 reference, just because of the similarities. And same thing with trying to make this feel like an airport, just because it feels a lot kind of like what we went through as far as bringing in all these new regulations and stopping people and checkpoints. And then same thing here. There are actually 9 stars on the presidential seal, but there are 13 clouds, and I replaced those clouds with the cuckoo eggs, but I went ahead and put 11 of them instead of 13, so that way it's 9 stars and 11 cuckoo eggs. So that's a pretty minor reference. It's just I had the opportunity to do it without changing the composition, so I thought, why not? And then, of course, the green grass here towards the painting's right is just showing that where the goat is encouraging them to go is obviously better. It's definitely a place where they should be, rather than all these harsh, sharp rocks. Another viewer brought up kind of an interesting interpretation, which I did not intend, but I'm kind of intrigued by it, of using the biblical parable of the sower, right, of sowing seeds, and some of the seeds fall on hard, rocky ground, and they can never really develop there. It's just not a place where they can improve, and others fall on pleasant ground. So I thought that was kind of an interesting interpretation of one viewer who commented on this.
And only one person has a cell phone taking a picture, I see. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this person has a cell phone, just the mentality people have of kind of always being a spectator, right? Taking pictures of whatever's going on. Maybe as proof of something, or maybe they just want a video for YouTube. There's also a couple other people with cell phones here in the background. The implication being that they're going to call this person in, right? This guy here is pointing at him and screaming towards the shepherds, obviously to apprehend the person who's not doing what they're supposed to. So a couple people calling them in with phones, and one physically doing so. And that, of course, is just a reference just to, how people are calling in anyone who's not cooperating. I've heard some people refer to them as balcony police.
Balcony police.
Have you been called in?
No, I haven't. I have multiple times been in a grocery store shopping, and I'll see them actually. They'll go up to a manager or someone and point me out and tell the manager to come talk to me. I've had that happen to me a couple times. But no one, for the most part, bothers calling law enforcement, because in this area they fortunately don't really have the enforcement capabilities, and a lot of sheriffs have just basically said they're not going to waste time with enforcing masks, which is good.
Yeah.
Good.
And the light source is coming from the right. Like, is there anything in your mind that's over there that's casting so much light upon them?
light direction itself didn't have particular significance to what the piece is, but I wanted the pieces in the foreground to look like they were basically in sunlight, as far as the bright sunlight of a clear day. And then as they got back, I wanted to replace that light more and more with a yellower, softer light coming from the hellish scene in the background.
Well, I know where people can go, but maybe you should tell them where they should go to. Well, either if they want to have a closer look at the painting, and then also if they want to buy the original, which is for sale, I believe, or
it is.
prints, of course.
So I have two websites, which is of course horrible that I do that, but I have to. One is called Jordan Henderson Art, and it's through Fine Art America, so jordanhenderson.pixels.com, and that's where I sell prints of all my pieces. And then a second website that I have is much easier to remember, and that's just Jordan Henderson Fine Art, and that's where I sell originals. And you can get to the other one from here just by going to the prints page.
Oh, okay.
So.
No, I'm very fond too of getting these things as greeting cards, which you offer.
Yes, I do offer greeting cards through the print site as well. So, yeah.
And I think there's even rugs, isn't there?
I think there's almost everything. Depends on which of the options I turn on, as it's through a third party that does all the printing.
I'm curious to know what your next painting is, if you've got one planned for the Corona.
Yeah, so the next painting dealing with coronavirus is actually the cover of your
your
upcoming novel.
I forgot about
that's
that.
Going to be an exciting one, because right here I just went with this painting, Sheep, Shepherds, and a Goat. I gave myself whatever I wanted, right? I just allowed myself to cram in as much information and figures and just keep increasing the complexity of the composition, which is fun. It's a lot of fun. But it's interesting to go the other way for a cover piece, right? Because obviously I can't do that, but I want to express something similar, but with something much simpler. So that's really the next piece. And then after this, there's like at least 7 or 8 COVID-related pieces I would like to do, approaching this from all kinds of different angles.
That's great. I remember the article I had wrote earlier this year, the one thing you can do to stop the nutty new normal, and I think number 3 on the list was I was hoping there would be an artist who did exactly what you ended up doing. I had actually predicted that. I said, the one that could depict in a image how crazy this all is.
Yeah. And I think it is, I don't know, it is easier maybe to convey that to someone who's reluctant about this with an image than just telling them, because that just kind of shuts down or brings up their defenses, I guess. Whereas a painting, at least they can look at without feeling too threatened, I hope.
Oh, yeah.
Now, why do you think you're so different? I mean, especially amongst the artistic community, they tend to, I find, accept this more than the average person, especially if you look in kind of mainstream stuff, but Hollywood and other forms of art. I've just found the artistic community is the one that generally accepts this story face value, and why don't you? You're an artist.
I think a lot of it could have to do with how controlled the artistic community is, right? Kind of like I was listening to an interview from a doctor speaking out against this, and she was being asked the same question, like, why are you opposed to this and a lot of doctors aren't? And she said, well, a lot of the doctors who are opposed to this have their own practice, so they can do what they want. Whereas, let's say something like Hollywood, you could have an artist in Hollywood who's really opposed to this, but they're going to have to ask a lot of permissions before anyone will allow them to bring that into a movie, right? So I think that could be part of it, that the art world is really closed up. It's really restricted, and it has been for a long time. And this is a little more outlandish, but it might be a possibility. The art world today has received a lot of criticism for basically putting forth their version of the Emperor's New Clothes, right? That there are some pieces put before the public as some of the greatest pieces ever, and it does feel suspiciously like the Emperor's New Clothes as far as what that art actually is. So maybe they are a little more in the habit of just kind of accepting that something is what they are told it is, rather than analyzing it for what it is, if that makes sense.
I also suspect too that a lot of artists are struggling financially and they don't want to put themselves in a position that might ostracize them even more.
That could be, and maybe to their credit, maybe a lot of them feel this isn't where their voice is, right? Like, I feel that a lot of art that gets maligned is celebrating just daily life, right? And I think there's a lot of value in that because it is celebrating daily life, right? It's showing how important it is, how significant it is. So I think there's a lot of value in that art as well. And maybe some artists feel that they have a stronger voice there than moving into this, but it is odd because this does present some really fascinating challenges artistically. And like, again, that there's so much that's visual about it, right? Like a lot of times you can have these differences, but both sides look the same. And here we have these differences, but both sides look decidedly different because people actually use a visual symbol to show which side they're on. So the opportunity for an artist is enormous, and it is surprising that more haven't jumped on board, or maybe I just haven't seen them, though I have been looking.
Huh. You're referring specifically to the mask, I assume.
Yes, specifically the mask.
Though I wasn't so much arguing that or pointing out that artists aren't necessarily painting or creating artwork to oppose this, but more so that I just found the artistic community tends to support these measures.
I found that same thing. That's definitely the case. Like a lot of shows are just complying completely. They've shut down or they're moving it all to virtual without really an attempt to resist it all. There does seem to be a lot of compliance in the artistic community.
And I mean, especially too with you just killed galleries.
Oh yeah.
It's
No, they certainly did.
I'm well, in some ways maybe I'm hoping it really works out well for you because I kind of doing what I did with the novel is like instead of letting this hurt your career, maybe it's what helps it take off because you've instead embraced what's happening and decided to make your art about it. I guess protesting it, but I think the one big difference between Sanity and Sun, your first painting, Sanity and Sun was much more. I don't say this in a negative way, but it had the feeling of hope. I remember when I first saw it on Off Guardian, I think that was the title they put for the headline promoting the painting was that this painting offered hope for the scary new normal that we're seeing, and the shepherds and the goats and the wolves. It's not as hopeful, I wouldn't say, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It's actually more of a slap in the face. Please wake up. But I don't know if you intentionally had that in mind when you did both paintings or not.
No, that is definitely the case because it's tempting to try to get every emotion into a painting, right? But the same thing I think both of us run into with our work is that we get more done the more things we can cut out of something. That's when we can really get more done. So at first this was going to be the only painting I was going to do on COVID-19, and then I started wanting to cram a bunch of these other elements in, and that's when I realized I needed to do multiple paintings to approach it from different angles and capture different emotions. So here that is something I did want to go into. It is more hopeful. It's celebrating their resistance, right? Of just a mother and her son just are not going to comply, and how significant that really is. It is a major thing that they are doing. And then it also contains some of the creepiness that I like adding, like this guy in the gas mask and his poor daughter having to deal with him in that gas mask. So it does have some of that creepiness, but definitely the focus here was more hopeful and celebrating people's resistance, whereas with the sheep, shepherds, and a goat, I did want to get into just a little more of the horror of the whole situation.
Reminded me of when I first saw it was in Pisa in Italy. If you go to the baptismal building beside the main church in Pisa, because back in the Middle Ages, non-Catholics weren't allowed in the church, so in order to baptize them, they always had to baptize them in a baptismal first before they could go into the church. And it has a mural on the wall. It's humongous, and it's left and right. On right side is heaven, where everyone's having a great time, And on the left side is hell, and it is the most hellish picture I've ever seen in my life, no less to have it in a religious building. I mean, there's literally... Actually, it makes yours look very Mr. Rogers.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's literally people with like a spike going through their bum and out their mouth while they're being turned on a spit over a fire for eternity.
Oh, that is horrid. Piece was a piece by the artist, I think his name is Vasily Vereshchagin, and it's called The Apotheosis of War. And what I admired about the piece is that it really brings across the horror of war, but it's not a lot of blood and gore. So again, the piece is fairly interesting. All these skulls being piled up. He dedicated the piece to all great conquerors, past, present, and future. So it really says a lot, but it's fairly tame actually.
Mm-hmm.
What does it show?
It's a pile of human skulls on looks like I guess it's a desert.
Yeah, a desert. It looks like an orchard that's been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
The village in the back that's been destroyed. And Vereshchagin was doing a lot of these paintings, I believe, in the late 19th century. And this sort of thing was still going on. There was a lot of battles between Russian troops and then the groups they were overtaking in, especially like that Kazakhstan type area, Central Asia, and piles of human skulls were still a thing, actually.
So they just chop a skull off the head with their swords? Like, just do it like that?
Yeah, it's interesting just to collect the skulls, and what do they do with the rest of the bones?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure where the rest went. But that was kind of a piece that I've gone back to a lot, especially with this piece, because I did want to bring across a lot of horror, but I didn't want to actually get into, like, chopped up people or anything like that, just suggest it.
It's only special people, though, are going to want fully framed on their living room wall.
Oh, very true.
Which are, I mean, they're there, and I mean, they'll probably get the full-size version and so forth. I was trying to find the quote. I had it in one of my books, and I couldn't, but they said, that's real art, because real art is not suitable for being over the chairs of a waiting room in a doctor's office.
That's
decoration.
True. You have to give yourself that option to push it if you want, yeah.
I think, too, that this piece actually would make it really good for the greeting card option. Greeting's not probably the best way to read the card, but it's like I've been using the Sanity and Sun greeting cards. I've sent it to a lot of politicians and bureaucrats because I think it's a wake-up image right there, and I think this might even be more of a wake-up image. Maybe not so much for the bureaucrats, because this looks great. They might say,
No!
that's about it. Yeah, great. Okay, no, but for other people, I'm thinking because I'm actually moving a lot of my protest towards. I'm tired of trying to convince the bureaucrats. I figure they're either really dumb or they're really corrupt, and it's not going to change. They're just going to do whatever they want. That I'm been more targeting actually people of influence, whether it's celebrities, musicians, business people in my town, and so forth. So I'm probably going to be using this image, especially for the artist types, like the musicians and novelists and so forth. People who have a voice and a following. That I'm not sure how much the businessmen would react to this or not, but I like it because it's a shocking picture, and I think that's what they need.
Yeah. And I know a lot of artists have run into that there's a lot of times they'll do a painting that other artists really enjoy, but they have a harder time with their broader audience. It really depends. It's just interesting that sometimes an artist will really get something in their head that they want to do, and they'll have a lot of fun with it, and artists will see a lot of fun in it, but it might not necessarily, like you say, be like the best marketing piece.
Oh, I was just going to say, I do think it works, though. I mean, the fact that you didn't try to pump everything into one painting means that every time we see a new painting, it's going to be a different experience.
Yes. Yeah.
There are some famous artists, and they do quite well, where every single one of their paintings looks exactly the same. It's just a different setting. I'm not going to name any names, but they got a look to their painting and a setting, and it's just a slight variation every time, and it works. For them.
And some people really focus on that. They say, you need your style. So, as soon as people see one of their paintings, they know it's your painting. as if you have to do that, I don't know, so people can kind of recognize you. But I don't really think that's true, because an American artist by the name of Winslow Homer is quite famous. He did well even during his time. And he did all kinds of different styles, and you can't really spot a Homer, really. Like when you see one of his paintings, you don't immediately know it's his. It could be his, it could be someone else's, so you see the signature. But personally, I wouldn't want to do that either way, because that'd get boring.
Yeah.
Do all the same.
I'll put the links below the video, like they always do, for both your websites, so that people can go and get some greeting cards and a full-size living room horrific painting over their couch of sheep going to slaughter. But no, I'll definitely put the links below the video, and I'm very appreciative for you giving us both the step-by-step explanation of all the elements in the painting.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you for doing the interview. It's nice being able to just take time and go over the whole thing, because it does take a while. There's quite a bit.